Hello there. Today I'm taking a look at a wine from Italy from one of the top producers of Barolo. So this is Barolo Bussia 2014 from Poderi Aldo Conterno. So we're in Piedmont in northern Italy, and a wine made from the Nebbiolo grape variety, a classic wine. Poderi Aldo Conterno, highly regarded, much sought after producer, making wines from the best parcels of this fantastic cru Bussia, which is located in Monteforte d'Alba. So Aldo Conterno himself was the second son of Giacomo Conterno, and Aldo founded his own estate in 1969 when he bought the Favot estate, which had these extensive holdings in the Bussia Cru. For the previous 8 years, along with his elder brother Giovanni, he'd run famous Giacomo Conterno estate. But by 1969, he felt the need to leave so that he could make wines in a less resolutely traditionalist environment. And Aldo Conterno came to be regarded by many critics as one of Barolo's most gifted winemakers. Aldo's position is interesting because he's viewed as a modernist. But I think this is more in comparison with the approach that his brother adopted than him necessarily being at the forefront of modernist Barolos. Because Aldo believed in making Barolos that aged at length in large Slavonian oak Botti, while he did occasionally use small amounts of French oak barriques. Their use wasn't widespread in his estate. Aldo's main concession to modernism was reducing the period of maceration that his wines underwent, so allowing them to be more aromatically expressive when young. And for that reason, I think the 2014 vintage could be quite interesting, because there's a balance to the climatic conditions encountered in 2014. Poderi Aldo Conterno actually applied longer maceration times. Now, Aldo Conterno died in 2012, so 2 years before this particular wine was made. But during his later years, he'd been handing over the running of the estate to his three sons. And today, Franco, Stefano and Giacomo Conterno still run the estate very much along the lines of the way their father did. Now, the estate's vineyard holding is about 25 hectares, almost entirely situated on south and southwest facing slopes with chalky soil at an altitude of around 400 metres above sea level. From within the cru of Bussia itself, they make 3 wines from individual parcels: Romarisco, Cicala and Colonnello. And then in the best years, they will take the fruit from the oldest sections of these 3 plots and produce a reserva wine called Gran Bussia. Now this particular wine, the Barolo Bussia, is made from younger plots of vines outside those 3 cru, with vine age stated at between 15 and 20 years. Anything younger than that goes into a Langhi Nebbiolo called Il Favot. They do also make Barbera d'Alba and a Langhe Rosso from vine plots within Bussia. And then the range is completed by a barrel fermented Chardonnay called Bussia d'OCG. Now, in the early 2000s, the estate converted their vineyards to being managed sustainably and organically. Having said that, they have no certification for that, but their practices involve farming with minimal chemical intervention. Most years they'll only allow copper sulfate and sulfur to be used within the vineyard, which are both allowed as organic preparations. One of the keys to the estate's success is the systematic reduction of yields. They'll use rigorous green harvests if necessary to keep yields down to somewhere in the region of 15 to 25 hectolitres per hectare. And the maximum total annual production for the estate is probably about 150,000 bottles across all the wines and varieties that they make. Now, the 2014 vintage for Piedmont was tricky. As I say, notes I've seen suggest that Conterno applied longer maceration times to try and maintain quality. The winter and spring were both unusually cold and wet, with temperatures really only picking up in May. However, from there on, conditions really warmed up quite quickly, and that meant that actually fruit set looked quite promising. The summer, however, failed to deliver in 2014, bringing both cool temperatures and vast volumes of rainfall. And Barolo seemed to do quite badly. I saw one note that suggested that Barolo got about 3 times the amount of rain that fell in Barbaresco. July even saw some quite vicious hailstorms hitting parts of Barolo. Thankfully, I think Aldo Conterno's vineyards largely dodged that issue. The weather, however, was warm enough that with the damp conditions there was quite high rot pressure in 2014. And I think that pretty much left any hopes of a legendary vintage that had been seen at fruit set absolutely dashed. Now conditions did clear up by late August, and actually from then through to harvest in mid-October there was warm sunny weather, which in combination with cooling breezes helped clear humidity and rid the vines of rot and disease. And as Nebbiolo is a late ripening variety, this late period of good weather was highly beneficial for it. Now the issues with hail and rot meant that the crop was smaller than usual and that quality was patchy. However, there were some really good Nebbiolos made, and those tended to come from the warmer, more free-drained sites, such as Bussia. However, most of the wines, even the successful ones in 2014, tended to be relatively light, supple, elegant, and not really ideal for long aging. So while 2014 wasn't a great vintage for Barolo, there are one or two wines that stand out. The wines of Aldo Conterno have been noted as being amongst those. Now, being a Barolo, obviously this is 100% Nebbiolo. There are two clones being used here, and those are known as Michet and Lampia. And these are the two most common high-quality clones of Nebbiolo, and they tend to be used in concert because Lampia gives relatively high yields and balanced wine, whereas Michet is low yielding, tends to be concentrated, has relatively good colour and complex flavours. Blending wines from these two clones actually tends to give rich wines that manage to be more balanced and nuanced. Harvest, as I say, went on in mid-October. This was done entirely by hand, involved a high degree of selection in the vineyard. Vinification was a very traditional red wine fermentation in stainless steel tanks. The peak temperature that was allowed was 32 degrees, so relatively high, relatively extractive, and while some notes I see suggest that maceration went on for between 20 and 30 days according to the lots, there are other notes suggesting that for some lots this went on for up to 6 weeks in 2014 as a means to mitigate the rather fragile nature of the vintage. The new wine was racked a couple of times before going into oak and spent 26 months aging in large Slavonian oak Botti, so large seasoned casks. I think Aldo Conterno was very clear about the fact that the vanilla sweetness imparted by using small French oak barrels, he didn't feel that that fitted particularly well with Nebbiolo as a variety. By comparison, the single plot wines received 28 to 30 months in oak, and the Gran Bussia sees 32 months. And I would assume that if there's going to be any small oak usage in the estate, it will be on those wines rather than this one. So let's have a look at the wine, shall we? I've got it here in a nice big glass so I can give it a good swirl. First thing to say is, typically for Barolo, it's not a particularly deep colour. I can see through this quite readily. It's a relatively dark ruby. In fact, I'd suggest it's possibly deeper than some Barolos I've seen, especially considering that this is a 12-year-old wine. Swirling it, the wine is labelled as having 13.5% alcohol. It's clearly quite tannic because it's very readily forming some tears or legs that are running down the glass there. It's quite viscous. So let's see what we make of the aroma, shall we? Some of the notes I read suggest that this wine has quite a dumb nose. I can certainly see what they mean there. Those aromas that are coming through, there's a delicate red fruit, but over the top of it there's a sort of a herbal note, almost a slightly resinous hint, something slightly green-edged. And I suppose there's some slightly developed forest floor notes, and those are really sort of overpowering any delicate red fruit aromas in there. I'm glad to say the notes I saw also suggested that the wine opens up in the palate, so let's see if those are right. On the palate, the wine is firm with quite a drying structure of very fine tannins that are apparent right from the outset. There are some slightly floral notes and some hints of some quite pretty red fruit around the edges of my tongue. However, where I would normally refer to the floral notes of Barolo as being rose petals, as well as the rose petal notes, there seems to be a hint of a slightly more powerful, almost lily of the valley-like perfume as well. The wine's acidity is fresh. The alcohol doesn't particularly impose itself on the palate. And actually, I think the wine might have benefited from an extra 0.5% of alcohol here, just to give it a little bit more richness on the palate. It's certainly got a presence as these fine, drying tannins run across the back of my palate. And actually, as they sit there, they're slowly opening up. And they're showing a mix of quite attractive, enduring red cherry fruit, along with some slightly more sort of developed forest floor notes. Having said that this is a 12-year-old wine, having seen others suggest that maybe it's slow to open up, I'll certainly be interested to taste it over the next day or so and see whether it will open further. Certainly, as I'm talking here, the flavours are continuing to open and to show a slightly more generous red fruit on the palate. The finish is long and it's still quite restrained. Certainly I think this is a wine that you could keep for another 5 to 10 years, but I'm unsure how much it will continue to evolve and open if you were to do that. Eventually it's opened up to be quite a nice example of an elegant Barolo, but I don't think it's really delivered the perfumed element of Nebbiolo that can make it so enchanting. Looked at the Wine Searcher aggregated critic score for this wine, and the combination of those reviews has brought this to a score of 92 out of 100. I think that's probably about correct. It would certainly to my mind be a 91 or a 92. But I would just like to see how it continues developing in my glass once I've finished this tasting, before I decide which of those work. So to that end, I should pop something in the note below and let you know how I get on. I will of course leave a link to the Wine Searcher website for this vintage of this wine, so you can see if it's still available anywhere near you, and if so, at what price. So thank you so much for watching. I do hope you found the tasting of interest. If you have, do please press the like button, that would be fantastic. If you're watching these videos and enjoying them, it would be fabulous if you'd consider signing up and subscribing to my channel. That support will really help me develop it further. If you have any friends you think might like to watch the video, do please feel free to pass it on to them. I would really appreciate your endorsement in that way. And if you have any comments or questions, do please pop them in the comments box below, because I'd love to know what you think about the tastings I'm doing, the wines I'm looking at, or anything else that relates to that. So thank you again for taking the time to join me, and I do hope that maybe you'll manage to find some time, come and join me for another video tasting in the very near future. Till then, bye for now.